Welcome back to Showreel. I'm Keanu Reeves.
And I'm Margaret Pomeranz. In the honour of our guest Chris Sun, we're reviewing the classic horror film Plan 9 from Outer Space. But don't worry, he had nothing to do with this film. He's not old enough. You can blame Edward D. Wood Jr., better known as Ed Wood. Let's take a look at the trailer.
It is safe to state that the grandchildren of some of the people in this theater will not be born on Earth. They come from the bowels of hell, a transformed race of walking dead, zombies guided by a master plan for complete domination of the Earth. Plan 9 from outer space.
Released in 1959 by now infamous director Ed Wood, Plan 9 from Outer Space, originally titled Grave Robbers from Outer Space, follows police inspectors and for some reason a pilot as they attempt to uncover a series of brutal murders by the undead. They discovered what looked like a spaceship was actually a spaceship, and the flashes they'd been seeing in the sky were aliens reanimating the dead, and it was being covered up by the US military, who were ignoring the aliens' warnings about a deadly sun bomb, or whatever it's called, they were building, which explodes the atoms of the sun. Now you know this movie is going to be interesting from the beginning. What film starring Vampiria couldn't be? Possibly the most questionable decision the production team made was to shoot the entire thing in a studio and then intercut it with footage of random people outside every now and then. But maybe my favourite moment was when the two characters, who I don't think you see for the rest of the film, point out a bizarre plot issue and then cover it up with an even more bizarre explanation. If you just let it be, we wouldn't have even noticed or cared that one of the corpses was buried in what appeared to be some bushes and her husband in some big grand tomb. Now, I haven't mentioned many interesting factors of the film yet, like the pilots, who appear to be baffled by a flying pot lid. Well, who wouldn't be, I guess. But I wouldn't call it an alien spaceship. And if you judge this movie just on the horrible acting, weird blocking, and complete lack of convincing props and set, sure, it sucks. But I think when you're judging it, you have to take into context the woeful special effects, ultra-dramatic soundtrack, and dialogue were all typical of low-budget films of the day. I'm not quite sure whether to say they just liked a different style back then, or they hadn't got it right yet. But the storyline, yeah, it's horrible. But if you have to take into consideration that we hate nonsensical and overdramatic plots because they were so overused back then. Writers could use obvious and nonsensical plot devices because audience had rarely seen better. It's like Michael Bay movies. Everyone loved huge computerized explosion and very little plot at one point in time, but now we're done with it. And the props were reminiscent of original Doctor Who even, which was actually made 4 years later than this movie. Well, what I'm trying to say is, can you honestly say this is better than Pain and Gain and R.I.P.D., which are competing for the worst films of the year? When it comes down to it, nothing can beat The Room. Plan 9 came to power when it was named the worst movie ever in 1980. The Room was made in 2003. I'm giving this film 1 star out of 5, but in 1959, I probably would have given it more. What do you think, Matt?
Now, we could do an entire show on this film, but I'll try to keep it short. Plan 9 from Outer Space is, without a doubt, a terrible movie. There is great sympathy for Ed Wood amongst fans of bad films, but his films are not just incredibly low budget, resulting in dodgy sets and unrealistic props. Everything else about this film is terrible too. The writing and acting are awful, though perhaps not quite as bad as The Room. There's no main protagonist, and the actor billed as the star of the film, the legendary Bela Lugosi, is hardly in it. He has no lines, and all his footage was shot for previous abandoned projects Ed Wood was working on. Lugosi died before production on this film started, so Ed Wood wrote the script to incorporate the otherwise irrelevant pre-existing footage. He then hired his wife's chiropractor, Tom Mason, to replace Lugosi in other scenes that required his character. However, this wasn't a perfect plan, because Tom looks absolutely nothing like Lugosi. He's much taller, has different hair, and is about 40 years younger. So he hilariously spends the entire film with his cloak pulled over his face so that only his eyes and the top of his head are visible, though it's still obviously not Lugosi. The only thing that ties all this nonsense together is the overused and sometimes on-screen narrator, Ed Wood's friend and terrible sidekick, Chris Well. The film has both aliens and zombies, but there aren't many of either. There are just 3 of each, and the aliens look human, so this film is hardly frightening. Lugosi plays one of the zombies, and his on-screen wife, who is 40 years younger than him, but about the same age as Tom, is another. The actress's name is Vampira. She's a horror television host and is essentially playing herself in this film, or rather, her on-screen persona. The other zombie is played by Swedish wrestler Tor Johnson, who was clearly cast for his appearance because his acting as Inspector Clay, before he's killed, is possibly the worst in the film. The zombies were resurrected by the aliens' advanced technology, which is pretty much just electricity, and the science behind it doesn't appear to be very sound. Now, I'm comparing this film to modern films, which may seem unfair, but that's what it's up against now, and it was considered bad in its time, so unless you really enjoy laughing at bad films, there is absolutely no reason to watch this. I'm giving it 1 star out of 5 too, but it's only getting a star at all because it did attempt to have some meaningful content, even if that was still a bit rubbish, and it was only 79 minutes long. So, you didn't think it was that bad for its day?
Well, I figure you have to look at movies like I can never remember the name of it, but like the Incredible Woman or whatever. Exactly, yeah, which I know is meant to be another bad film. But movies like that have such bad special effects because obviously they had no special effects back then. I figure with movies like that, I try and look at it, what would this movie be like if it was made now? And then would it be horrible? Yeah, it would still be horrible, but not as bad as it is.
I mean, if you look at Birdemic, which is probably comparable in quality, but it's terrible because they have no budget and the CGI is just shocking. Yeah. But I mean, it could have been a better film. It was just made by a really bad filmmaker, and I think, sorry to Ed Wood, but he's just terrible. I mean, and the reason why it's even worse is because they had no equipment in those days that was affordable. So if you had a low budget, you had to make do with very little. I mean, their cameras were probably made of coconuts and they had to use a flaming potato as a light or something. And you try and tell the young people of today that, they won't believe you.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks to all the children who sent in pictures of the show. Unfortunately, we can't return them, but we will take good care of them.
Remember to watch all of Chris's films and buy all his stuff. Join us again at the same time next week for more Showreel, when we chat with Brenna Lee Cooney from Fractal Theatre. See you then.
I'm losing time.